Well, I hope we're all a bit wiser. It's kind of creepy, isn't it, the way when you look back into history at the details of what went on, how these people planned and schemed in really a totally immoral way to produce an outcome which remains totally unacceptable. However, we can't do much about it apart from raise consciousness and hope that we can change the minds of enough people and get them active enough to cause enough outrage, to cause our governments to act on our behalf to change things in that benighted region. Okay, I hope your microphone's working, Professor Massad. Can we hear him? Yeah. Can we hear him? Good. So we're going to talk a little bit about Zionism, and I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I know you're tired. I shall venture to be lively and keep you awake for the remainder of the evening. My talk this evening is entitled "The Last of the Semites." Jewish opponents of Zionism understood the movement since its early age as one that shared the precepts of anti-Semitism in its diagnosis of what gentle Europeans called the Jewish question. What galled anti-Zionist Jews the most, however, was that Zionism also shared the solution to the Jewish question, and that anti-Semites had always advocated, namely, the expulsion of Jews from Europe. It was the Protestant Reformation, with its revival of the Hebrew Bible, that would link the modern Jews of Europe to the ancient Hebrews of Palestine, a link that the philologists of the 18th century would solidify through their discovery of the family of Semitic languages, including Hebrew and Arabic. Whereas millenarian Protestants insisted that contemporary Jews, as descendants of the ancient Hebrews, must leave Europe to Palestine to expedite the second coming of Christ, philological discoveries led to the labeling of contemporary Jews as Semites. The leap that the biological sciences of race and heredity would make in the 19th century of considering contemporary European Jews racial descendants of the ancient Hebrews would, as a result, not be a giant one. Basing themselves on the connections made by the anti-Jewish Protestant millenarians, secular European figures who saw the political potential of restoring Jews to Palestine abounded in the 19th century. Less interested in expediting the second coming of Christ, as were the millenarians, these secular politicians, from Napoleon Bonaparte to British Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, to Ernest L'Aran, the private secretary of Napoleon III in the 1860s, sought to expel the Jews of Europe to Palestine in order to set them up as agents of European imperialism in Asia. Their call would be espoused by many anti-Semites, a new label chosen by European anti-Jewish racists after its invention in 1879 by a minor Viennese journalist by the name of Wilhelm Marr, who issued a political program titled "The Victory of Judaism over Germanism." Marr was careful to decouple anti-Semitism from the history of Christian hatred of Jews on the basis of religion, emphasizing, in line with Semitic philology and racial theories of the 19th century, that the distinction to be made between Jews and Aryans was strictly racial. Scientific anti-Semitism insisted that the Jews were different from Christian Europeans. Indeed, that the Jews were not European at all, and that their very presence in Europe is what causes anti-Semitism. The reason why Jews caused so many problems for European Christians had to do with their alleged rootlessness, that they lacked a country, and hence country-based loyalty. In the Romantic age of European nationalism, anti-Semites argued that Jews did not fit in the new national configurations and disrupted national and racial purity is central to most European nationalisms. This is why, if the Jews remained in Europe, the anti-Semites argued they could only cause hostility among Christian Europeans. The only solution was for the Jews to exit from Europe and have their own country. Needless to say, religious and secular Jews both opposed this horrific anti-Semitic line of thinking. Orthodox and Reform Jews, socialist and communist Jews, cosmopolitan and Yiddishkeit cultural Jews all agreed that this was a dangerous ideology of hostility that sought the expulsion of Jews from their European homelands. The Jewish Haskalah, or Enlightenment, which emerged also in the 19th century, sought to assimilate Jews into European secular Gentile culture and have them shed their Jewish culture. It was the Haskalah that sought to break the hegemony of Orthodox Jewish rabbis on the Ostjuden of the East European shtetl and to shed what it perceived as a medieval Jewish culture in favor of the modern secular culture of European Christians. Reform Judaism, as a Christian and Protestant-like variant of Judaism, would emerge from the bosom of the Haskalah. This assimilationist program, however, sought to integrate Jews in European modernity, not to expel them outside Europe's geography. When Zionism started a decade and a half after Marr's anti-Semitic program was published, it would espouse all these anti-Jewish ideas, including scientific anti-Semitism, as valid. For Zionism, Jews were Semites who were descendants of the ancient Hebrews. In his foundational pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, Herzl explained that it was Jews, not their Christian enemies, who caused anti-Semitism, and that, and I quote him, where it does not exist, anti-Semitism is carried by Jews in the course of their migrations. Indeed, that the unfortunate Jews are now carrying the seeds of anti-Semitism into England. They have already introduced it into America, end of quote. For Herzl, Jews were also a nation that should leave Europe to restore their nationhood in Palestine, or for him also in Argentina. That Jews must emulate European Christians culturally and abandon their living languages and traditions in favor of modern European languages or a restored ancient national language. Herzl preferred that all Jews adopt German, while the East European Zionists wanted Hebrew. Zionists after Herzl even agreed and affirmed that Jews were separate racially from Aryans. As for Yiddish, the living language of most European Jews, all Zionists agreed that it should be abandoned. The majority of Jews continued to resist Zionism and understood its precepts as those of anti-Semitism and as a continuation of the Haskalah quest to shed Jewish culture and assimilate Jews into European secular Gentile culture, except that Zionism sought the latter not inside Europe, but at a geographical remove following the expulsion of Jews from Europe. The Bund, or the General Jewish Labor Union in Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, which was founded in Vilna in early October 1897, just a few weeks after the convening of the First Zionist Congress in Basel in late August 1897, the Bund would become Zionism's fiercest enemy. The Bund joined the existing anti-Zionist Jewish coalition of Orthodox and Reform rabbis who had combined forces a few months earlier to prevent Herzl from convening the First Zionist Congress in Munich, very close to here, which forced him to move it to Basel. Jewish anti-Zionism across Europe and the United States had the support of the majority of Jews who continued to view Zionism as an anti-Jewish movement well into the 1940s. Realizing that its plan for the future of European Jews was in line with those of anti-Semites, Herzl strategized early on an alliance with the latter. He declared in his book Der Judenstaat that, quote, "The governments of all countries scourged by anti-Semitism will be keenly interested in assisting us to obtain the sovereignty we want." He added that, quote, not only poor Jews would contribute to an immigration fund for European Jews, but also Christians who wanted to get rid of them. Herzl unapologetically confided in his diaries, and I quote him, that the anti-Semites, quote, will become our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries our allies, unquote. Thus, when Herzl began to meet in 1903 with infamous anti-Semites like the Russian Minister of Interior, von Plehve, who oversaw anti-Jewish pogroms in Russia, it was an alliance that he sought by design. That it would be the anti-Semitic Lord Balfour, who as Prime Minister of Britain in 1905 oversaw his government's Aliens Act, which prevented East European Jews fleeing Russian pogroms from entering Britain in order, as he put it, to save the country from, quote, the undoubted evils of an immigration which was largely Jewish, was hardly coincidental. Balfour's infamous declaration of 1917 to create in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people was designed, among other things, to curb Jewish support for the Russian Revolution and to stem the tide of further unwanted Jewish immigrants into Britain. The Nazis would not be an exception to this anti-Semitic chain of pro-Zionist enthusiasts. Indeed, the Zionists would strike a deal with the Nazis very early in their history. It was in 1933 that the infamous transfer or Ha'avara agreement was signed between the Zionists and the Nazi government to facilitate the transfer of German Jews and their property to Palestine, and which broke the international Jewish boycott of Nazi Germany started by American Jews. It was in this spirit that Zionist envoys were dispatched to Palestine to report on the successes of Jewish colonization of the country. Adolf Eichmann returned from his 1937 trip to Palestine full of fantastic stories about the achievements of the racially separatist Ashkenazi kibbutzes, one of which he visited on Mount Carmel as a guest of the Zionists. Despite the overwhelming opposition of most German Jews, it was the Zionist Federation of Germany that was the only Jewish group, and it was a minority group, that supported the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, as they agreed with the Nazis that Jews and Aryans were separate and separable races. This was not a tactical support, but one based on ideological similitude. The Nazis' final solution initially meant the expulsion of Germany's Jews to Madagascar. It is this shared goal of expelling Jews from Europe as a separate, unassimilable race that created the affinity between Nazis and Zionists all along. While the majority of Jews continued to resist this anti-Semitic basis of Zionism and its alliances with anti-Semites, the Nazi genocide not only killed 90% of European Jews, but in the process also killed the majority of Jewish enemies of Zionism, who died precisely because they refused to heed the Zionist call of abandoning their countries and homes. After the war, the horror at the Jewish Holocaust did not stop European countries from supporting the anti-Semitic program of Zionism. On the contrary, these countries shared with the Nazis a predilection for Zionism. They only opposed Nazism's genocidal program. European countries, along with the United States, refused to take in hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. In fact, these countries voted against a United Nations resolution introduced by the Arab states in 1947, calling on them to take the Jewish survivors. Yet these same countries would be the ones who would support the United Nations partition plan of November 1947 to create a Jewish state in Palestine to which these unwanted European Jewish refugees could be expelled. The United States and European countries, including Germany, would continue the pro-Zionist policies of the Nazis. Post-war West German governments who presented themselves as opening a new page in their relationship with Jews in reality did no such thing. Since the establishment of the country after World War II, every West German government and every German government since unification in 1990 has continued the pro-Zionist Nazi policies unabated. there was never a break with Nazi pro-Zionism. The only break was with the genocidal and racial hatred of Jews that Nazism consecrated, but not with the desire to see Jews set up in a country in Asia away from Europe. Indeed, the Germans would explain that much of the money they were sending to Israel was to help offset the costs of resettling European Jewish refugees in the country. After World War II, a new consensus emerged in the United States and Europe that Jews had to be integrated posthumously into white Europeanness, and that the horror of the Jewish Holocaust was essentially a horror at the murder of white Europeans. Since the 1960s, Hollywood films about the Holocaust began to depict Jewish victims of Nazism as white, Christian-looking, middle-class, educated, and talented people, not unlike contemporary European and American Christians who should and would identify with them. Presumably, if the films were to depict the poor religious Jews of Eastern Europe, and most East European Jews who were killed by the Nazis were poor and many were religious, contemporary white Christians would not find commonality with them. Hence, the post-Holocaust European Christian horror at the genocide of European Jews was not based on the horror of slaughtering people in the millions who were different from European Christians, but rather a horror at the murder of millions of people who were the same as European Christians. This explains why, in a country like the United States, which had nothing to do with the slaughter of European Jews, there exists upwards of 40 Holocaust memorials and a major museum for the murdered Jews of Europe, but not one for the Holocaust of Native Americans or African Americans, for which the United States bears responsibility. The poet Aimé Césaire understood this process very well. In his famous speech on colonialism, he affirmed that the retrospective view of European Christians about Nazism is, and I quote him, that it is barbarism, but the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms. That it is Nazism, yes, but that before Europeans were its victims, they were its accomplices. And they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them. That they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples. That they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack, unquote. That for Césaire, the Nazi wars and Holocaust were European colonialism turned inwards is true enough. But since the rehabilitation of Nazism's victims as white people, Europe and its American accomplice would continue their Nazi policy of visiting horrors on non-white people around the world, on Korea, on Vietnam and Indochina, on Algeria, on Indonesia, on Central and South America, on Central and South Africa, on Palestine, on Iran, and on Iraq and Afghanistan. The rehabilitation of European Jews after World War II was a crucial part of US Cold War propaganda. As American social scientists and ideologues developed the theory of totalitarianism, which posited Soviet communism and Nazism as essentially the same type of regime, European Jews, as victims of one totalitarian regime, became part of the atrocity exhibition that American and West European propaganda claimed was like the atrocities that the Soviet regime was allegedly committing in the pre- and post-war periods. That Israel would jump on the bandwagon by accusing the Soviets of anti-Semitism for the refusal to allow Soviet Jewish citizens to self-expel and leave to Israel was part of that propaganda. It was thus that the European and US commitment to white supremacy was preserved, except that it now included Jews as part of white people, and what came to be called and invented as the Judeo-Christian civilization. European and American policies after World War II which continued to be inspired and dictated by racism against Native Americans, Africans, Asians, Arabs, and Muslims, and continued to support Zionism's anti-Semitic program of assimilating Jews into whiteness in a colonial settler state away from Europe, were a direct continuation of anti-Semitic policies prevalent before the war. It was just that much of the anti-Semitic racialist venom would now be directed at Arabs and Muslims, both those who are immigrants and citizens in Europe and the United States, and those who live in Asia and Africa, while the erstwhile anti-Semitic support for Zionism would continue unhindered. West Germany's alliance with Zionism and Israel after World War II, of supplying Israel with huge economic aid in the 1950s, and of economic and military aid since the early 1960s, including tanks, which it used to kill Palestinians and other Arabs, is a continuation of the alliance that the Nazi government concluded with the Zionists in the 1930s. In the 1960s, West Germany even provided military training to Israeli soldiers, and since the 1970s has provided Israel with nuclear-ready German-made submarines with which Israel hopes to kill more Arabs and Muslims. Israel has in recent years armed the most recent German-supplied submarines with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, a fact that is well known to the current German government. Israel's defense minister, Ehud Barak, last year told Der Spiegel that Germans should, quote, be proud that they have secured the existence of the State of Israel for many years, unquote. Berlin financed 1/3 of the cost of the submarines, around 135 million euros per submarine, and has allowed Israel to defer its payment until 2015. That this makes Germany an accomplice in the dispossession of the Palestinians is of no more concern to current German governments than it was in the 1960s to West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who affirmed that, quote, the Federal Republic has neither the right nor the responsibility to take a position on the Palestinian refugees, unquote. This is to be added to the massive billions that Germany has paid to the Israeli government as compensation for the Holocaust, as if Israel and Zionism were the victims of Nazism, when in reality it was anti-Zionist Jews who were killed by the Nazis. The current German government does not care about the fact that even those German Jews who fled the Nazis and ended up in Palestine hated Zionism and its project, and were hated in turn by Zionist colonists in Palestine. As German refugees in the 1930s and 40s Palestine refused to learn Hebrew and published half a dozen German newspapers in the country, they were attacked by the Hebrew press, including by Haaretz, which called for the closure of their newspapers in 1939 and again in 1941. Zionist colonists attacked a German-owned cafe in Tel Aviv because its Jewish owners refused to speak Hebrew. And the Tel Aviv municipality threatened in June 1944 some of its German Jewish residents for holding in their home on 21 Alembi Street, quote, parties and balls entirely in the German language, including programs that are foreign to the spirit of our city, and that this would not be tolerated in Tel Aviv, unquote. German Jews, or Yekkes, as they were known in the Yeshuv, would even organize a celebration of the Kaiser's birthday in 1941. Add to that Germany's support for Israeli policies against Palestinians at the United Nations, and the picture becomes complete. Even the new Holocaust memorial built in Berlin that opened in 2005 maintains Nazi racial apartheid, as this, quote, memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe is only for Jewish victims of the Nazis, who must still today be set apart as Hitler mandated from other millions of non-Jews who also fell victim to Nazism. That a subsidiary of the German company, Degussa, which collaborated with the Nazis and which produced the Zyklon B gas that was used to kill people in the gas chambers, was contracted to build the memorial in Berlin, was anything but surprising, as it simply confirms that those who killed Jews in Germany in the late 1930s and in the 1940s now regret what they had done because they now understand Jews to be white Europeans who must be commemorated and who should not have been killed in the first place on account of their whiteness. The German policy of abetting the killing of Arabs by Israel, however, is hardly unrelated to this commitment to anti-Semitism, which continues through the predominant contemporary anti-Muslim German racism that targets Muslim immigrants. The Jewish Holocaust killed off the majority of Jews who fought and struggled against European anti-Semitism, including Zionism. With their death, the only remaining Semites who are fighting against Zionism and its anti-Semitism today are the Palestinian people. Whereas Israel insists that European Jews do not belong in Europe and must come to Palestine, the Palestinians have always insisted that the homelands of European Jews were their European countries and not Palestine, and that Zionist colonialism springs from its very anti-Semitism. Whereas Zionism insists that Jews are a race separate from European Christians, the Palestinians insist that European Jews are nothing if not European and have nothing to do with Palestine, its people, or its culture. What Israel and its American and European allies have sought to do in the last 6.5 decades is to convince Palestinians that they too must become anti-Semites and believe, as the Nazis, Israel, and its Western anti-Semitic allies do, that Jews are a race that is different from European races, that Palestine is their country, and that Israel speaks for all Jews. That the two largest American pro-Israel voting blocs today are millenarian Protestants and secular imperialists continues the very same Euro-American anti-Jewish tradition that extends back to the Protestant Reformation and 19th century imperialism. But the Palestinians have remained unconvinced and steadfast in their resistance to anti-Semitism. Israel and its anti-Semitic allies affirm that Israel is the Jewish people, that its policies are Jewish policies, that its achievements are Jewish achievements, that its crimes are Jewish crimes, and that therefore anyone who dares to criticize Israel is criticizing Jews and must be anti-Semitic. The Palestinian people have mounted a major struggle against this anti-Semitic incitement. They continue to affirm instead that the Israeli government does not speak for all Jews, that it does not represent all Jews, and that its colonial crimes against the Palestinian people are its own crimes and not the crimes of the Jewish people, and that therefore it must be criticized, condemned, and prosecuted for its ongoing war crimes against the Palestinian people. This is not a new Palestinian position, but one that was adopted since the turn of the 20th century and continued throughout the pre-World War II Palestinian struggle against Zionism. Yasser Arafat's speech at the United Nations in 1974 stressed all these points vehemently. Let me quote him for you at length. Just as colonialism heedlessly used the wretched, the poor, the exploited as mere inert matter with which to build and to carry out settler colonialism, so too were destitute, oppressed European Jews employed on behalf of world imperialism and of the Zionist leadership. European Jews were transformed into the instruments of aggression. They became the elements of settler colonialism intimately allied to racial discrimination. Zionist theology was utilized against our Palestinian people. The purpose was not only the establishment of Western-style settler colonialism, but also the severing of Jews from their various homelands and subsequently their estrangement from their nations. Zionism is united with anti-Semitism in its retrograde tenets and is, when all is said and done, another side of the same base coin. For when what is proposed is that adherents of the Jewish faith, regardless of their national residence, should neither owe allegiance to their national residence nor live on equal footing with its other non-Jewish citizens, when that is proposed, we hear anti-Semitism being proposed. Arafat continues, when it is proposed that the only solution for the Jewish problem is that Jews must alienate themselves from communities or nations of which they have been a historical part, when it is proposed that Jews solve the Jewish problem by immigrating to and forcibly settling the land of another people, when this occurs, exactly the same position is being advocated as the one urged by anti-Semites against Jews, unquote. Israel's claim that its critics must be anti-Semites presupposes that its critics believe its claims that it represents the Jewish people. But it is Israel's claims that it represents and speaks for all Jews that are the most anti-Semitic claims of all. Today, Israel and the Western powers want to elevate anti-Semitism to an international principle, around which they seek to establish full consensus. They insist that for there to be peace in the Middle East, Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims must become, like the West, anti-Semites by espousing Zionism and recognizing Israel's anti-Semitic claims. Except for dictatorial Arab regimes and the Palestinian Authority, on this 65th anniversary of the anti-Semitic conquest of Palestine by the Zionists, known to Palestinians as the Nakba, the Palestinian people and the few surviving anti-Zionist Jews continue to refuse to heed this international call and incitement to anti-Semitism. They affirm that they are, as the last of the Semites, the heirs of the pre-World War II Jewish and Palestinian struggles against anti-Semitism and its Zionist colonial manifestation. It is their resistance that stands in the way of a complete victory for European anti-Semitism in the Middle East and the world at large. Thank you.
Well, I hope we're all a bit wiser. It's kind of creepy, isn't it, the way when you look back into history at the details of what went on, how these people planned and schemed in really a totally immoral way to produce an outcome which remains totally unacceptable. However, we can't do much about it.
Remainder of the evening. My talk this evening is entitled The Last of the Semites. Jewish opponents of Zionism understood the movement since its early age as one that shared the precepts of anti-Semitism in its diagnosis of what gentle Europeans called the Jewish question. What galled anti-Zionist Jews the most, however, was that Zionism also shared the solution to the Jewish question, and that anti-Semites had always advocated, namely, the expulsion of Jews from Europe. It was the Protestant Reformation, with its revival of the Hebrew Bible, that would link the modern Jews of Europe to the ancient Hebrews of Palestine, a link that the philologists of the 18th century would solidify through their discovery of the family of Less interested in expediting the second coming of Christ, as were the millenarians, these secular politicians, from Napoleon Bonaparte to British Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, to Ernest L'Aran, the private secretary of Napoleon III in the 1860s, sought to expel the Jews of Europe to Palestine in order to set them up as agents of European imperialism in Asia. Their call would be espoused by many anti-Semites, a new label chosen by European anti-Jewish racists after its invention in 1879 by a minor Viennese journalist by the name of Wilhelm Marr, who issued a political program titled The Victory of Judaism over Germanism. Marr was careful to decouple anti-Semitism from the history of Christian hatred of Jews on the basis of Semitic languages, including Hebrew and Arabic. Whereas millenarian Protestants insisted that contemporary Jews, as descendants of the ancient Hebrews, must leave Europe to Palestine to expedite the second coming of Christ, philological discoveries led to the labeling of contemporary Jews as Semites. The leap that the biological sciences of race and heredity would make in the 19th century of considering contemporary European Jews racial descendants of the ancient Hebrews would, as a result, not be a giant one. Basing themselves on the connections made by the anti-Jewish Protestant millenarians, secular European figures who saw the political potential of restoring Jews to Palestine abounded in the 19th century.
Apart from raised consciousness and hope that we can change the minds of enough people and get them active enough to cause enough outrage, to cause our governments to act on our behalf to change things in that benighted region. Okay, I hope your microphone's working, Professor Massad. Can we hear him?
Yeah.
Can we hear him? Good. So we're going to talk a little bit about Zionism, and I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I know you're tired. I shall venture to be lively and keep you awake.